coffee, big cup, and hello. Welcome to another episode of the Gilmore Way Podcast. This week, we're returning to a discussion of generational issues and differences on display between the three Gilmore generations, and how the revival handed the discourse around Rory's millennial generation. Because raise your hand if you've ever been personally victimized by Amy Sherman-Palladino's views about millennials.
A little bit. But before we get started, this is your regular weekly reminder that we're running a Spoilers All podcast. If you haven't seen the show, I just don't know what to tell you, except that I'm disappointed and dismayed. And if you could quickly smash the like and subscribe buttons and remember to share this to your friends, maybe leave us a comment, we would be eternally grateful. All the engagement really helps us.
We're going to kick things off with our just usual synopses as always, and we start off with episode 5 of season 4, The Fundamental Things Apply. And Rory gets asked out on a date by a classmate. She initially turns him down, but after talking to Lorelai about her paltry dating history, she reconsiders. And while on the date, she feels awkward and out of her depth. She also eventually asks out a guy from her dorm that she clicks with in the laundry room, but he says he's not interested. I mean, Rory Gilmore get rejected? Like, how dare you, sir? But meanwhile, Lorelai is hunting for the perfect interior decorator for the Dragonfly and meets Natalie. But things go sour when she finds out that Natalie worked with Emily in the past. Lorelai also has Luke over for movie night, and she introduces him to Casablanca and Hard Bodies.
We didn't even get to the whole Natalie interior design of the Dragonfly thing in our interior design episode last week. Wow.
We did not. Always maybe to circle back on.
Yeah, maybe we'll do a part 2 someday because we didn't talk about the Independence or the Dragonfly or a bunch of other stuff. So go back and check that one out if you haven't seen it. But moving along, season 4, episode 6 is An Affair to Remember. Lorelai and Suki are hired by Emily to cater Richard and Jason's launch party, but Jason's rejection of an old stuffy cocktail party in favor of taking clients to Atlantic City rubs Emily the wrong way and gets Lorelai and Suki, quote unquote, fired because they were the ones catering the event. Lorelai confronts Jason about this, and there's a bit of a spark between them. Jason asks her out, but she declines. For now. Rory's study schedule is upended by one of her professors, and she desperately tries to find a quiet place to study. She finds the perfect tree on campus, and when someone steals it, she freaks out and then eventually offers him $20 to give it up. Kirk goes on his first date with the adorable Lulu, with a bit of help and encouragement from Luke, of all people.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. I love An Affair to Remember. I feel like it's one of those great underrated episodes that has all of the best things that make Gilmore Girls what it is. It's so quintessentially Gigi in my mind. It's got a full range of family dynamics, excellent snark and wit. I love when Lorelai asks Jason what would happen if he took away planning parties from his mom. He's like, more time with the pool boy? It's such a great line. It's got one of Kirk's best moments with the whole first date with Lulu. His bonding with Luke is adorable. And yeah, ultimately it is the inspiration for this week's topic because the whole kind of dynamic with Jason wanting to do new things and move away from those stuffy conventions of business made me think we obviously have 3 generations of Gilmore women and they all have very different ideas about their roles and place in society. And Emily's is very much based on her role in Richard's business life and her role as his wife. Whereas Lorelai is far more independent. And Rory is kind of somewhere in the middle and a little bit more lost. She's not quite as fiercely independent as Lorelai is, but she's not ready to be a corporate wife. So looking at the differences between the generations, and not just with the Gilmore Girls, but with Richard and with Jason and with Luke and Jess and all of these other characters, we start to see different societal attitudes coming to the forefront with these storylines. And so I wanted to talk about this here. And I feel like the bulk of this episode really is going to be talking about the 30-something gang, because that's kind of where we found the most fruitful area for analysis. We will be talking about the revival in full at a later date. And if something gets missed in this episode, we'll probably just push it to that. But I feel like it really deserves its own its own moment here, and it kind of was like a spin-off of that idea. So let's kick it off.
Yeah. Do you have any specific place that you would like to start? Otherwise, I can pose you with a very just general broad question to kick off this conversation.
Why don't you kick us off?
Okay. Again, this is a lot of food for thought here. It's kind of maybe a little bit heavy hitting off the bat, but I'm going to ask it to you anyway. Do you think that the generational differences that we see within the show and the issues and the problems that arise from these generational differences are seen most prevalently within a particular social class? Or do you think that this is something that affects all of the younger generation and young people in general, despite where they fall on that spectrum? I'll follow it up by also saying that if you feel that it is most commonly seen in a particular social class, why do you think that is? And are these challenges being perpetuated by society on the whole, regardless of where any one person falls in terms of having financial privilege or a lack thereof?
You're right, that is heavy hitting. What a place to start. Yeah, the intersection of class and generation is very interesting. I feel like lower classes or lower income households, I hate using the term lower classes. It really like rubs me the wrong way, but it's just like for the purpose of this show and sort of the attitudes toward them, like that's how they would speak about them. Like that's how Emily would talk about them. So I'm like, ugh, gross. Lower income people tend to have to enter the workforce sooner and grow up faster than those in the upper crusty moneyed classes. And it's something we maybe don't like make the connection of quite so much when we talk about Gilmore, at least not that I've seen out in the fandom, because you get characters like Christopher and Logan who come from money, but who were allowed to have prolonged adolescences basically, and were not really forced to grow up until they were well into their 20s. And I think that's fairly typical of upper crust families, because if you think about it, their financial security allows them to kind of enjoy their younger years in a way that some people just literally cannot economically afford to. They're able to get a good education and postpone entering the workforce, and they're able to travel while they're young and unmarried and don't have kids yet. And even when they do sort of start to attain these markers of adulthood, like buying their first house or getting married or even having their first kid, they're almost like achieving the markers of adulthood without always having the like the experience to back it up, if you will. Like, I think of Emily and Richard when I think about this, but it's like they were what, 23 or something when they got married. I think they were engaged at 22. Lorelai was born, I think, around the time that Emily would have been 24. So like quite young by our modern standards. Really just coming out of school. Emily didn't have a job or anything. And then she and Richard get this big house, and suddenly she has a whole household to manage, but she has help. She's able to pay people to help her with the adulting tasks that are, that we talk about so much these days as things that people of the millennial generation often struggle to do or are delayed in doing. And so you can have this veneer of maturity and adulthood because your family wealth helps you achieve those things without actually sort of like doing the work to get there on your own and earning those things yourself. And with Emily and Richard having household staff to help them do stuff, I think they're sort of, in their own way, stuck in their developmental stages in the same way that we talk about Lorelai being sort of stuck at 16 when she has Rory. They're almost stuck in their 20s where, like, look at what happens when their maid can't make it in with the snowstorm. They don't even know how to make a frozen pizza. Like, they can't cook for themselves. They can barely clean for themselves. They just assume that people are going to do things for them. So, like, when we talk about millennial entitlement and class, it feels like the upper classes do a lot of the same things that people bag on millennials for.
Yeah, I agree, but I will counter this by saying that I think it's how the upper class is perceived and how they always want to be perceived that allows these like horrific generational. I'm not going to be able to talk.
You can't do that word for some reason. What is that?
I can't do this word. It always gets me. But I feel like how they always want to be perceived by other members of upper class society just really disallows for any progression within the millennial generation and potentially with any future generations to just do better. Because I feel like they always want to have that mindset of, I want my kids to be successful, to get a quality education, to start the nuclear family unit that we expect them to have, and then just to have kids and just go down that path, because that's what's always going to make us look good generation after generation after generation. I feel like even like, I mean, look at the Huntsbergers. I feel like they're very guilty of that, where Mitchum was always just like, my son needs to carry on the family name, you know, get into a good business. You know, my daughter needs to marry an up-to-do, like, wealthy man, because that's what's just going to allow us to look as well and as affluent as we can to society. And so I feel like maybe, again, I agree with you. I hate using the term, but perhaps individuals within the middle to lower class might have a better chance of just putting a hard stop on a lot of these differences that we see that just really, I think, hinder the youth and still continue to hinder the youth. Because if we can, you know, go to our kids and these future generations and say, like, listen, if you need to take some time to think about what you want to do in college and where you want to go and what you want to study, take your time. It doesn't mean that you need to dive into it at the age of 18 if you want a year to think about it. If you don't graduate until you're 24 or you're 25 because you needed that time, it's okay. If you don't settle into a solid career path that is fulfilling to you until perhaps your late 20s or early 30s or even your mid 30s, because again, you need that time to figure out what's going to allow best for your happiness and your success in life, do it. And I think perhaps, again, members of the middle to lower class and people who are not as well off are more inclined to allow that freedom to their kids, because at the end of the day, you know, the economy is what the economy is at this point. The struggle bus is there regardless of that path at this point or how many years it takes you to get there. I think there's going to be a more shift that towards that, like, happiness and that self-satisfaction that happens within people who are maybe not as well off, because they're not so concerned with just being seen as, you know, glamorous, so to say.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of expectation placed on people by their class and their cultural capital. You know, look at Christopher and his parents and how they reacted to him not going to Princeton. We don't know actually where he went, but he must have done some sort of education because he ends up working in software, which is a very, like, technical field. And so he must have had some sort of training along the way somewhere. And yeah, people have been talking about slow adulting. That kind of, you know, resonates with this. And really nobody in Gilmore was allowed to do that, ironically. Like, well, maybe Rory to a degree. She was kind of able to reject the idea of the markers of adulthood by rejecting Logan's marriage proposal and by taking a job on the road and getting some life experience before being expected to settle down, right? But, like, look at Lane. She gets saddled with a husband and 2 kids at the age of 22. Like, a lot of people aren't doing that anymore because we have a lot more choice and we're deciding to put these things off either for personal reasons or for financial ones. And so the fact that so many of the characters on this show are hamstrung into these positions of lack of choice is among the list of reasons why I'm like, is this show really feminist? I don't know about that. But yeah, the upper classes tend to expect more out of their kids and expect them to follow a much more rigid path to begin with, not just when it comes to like academic attainment or whatever, but just in general, like marriage, house, kids, like they're expected to follow that, and they're expected to look shiny while doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And doing things the right way, societally, socially speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Which is BS.
It is quite a load of BS. Thankfully, we don't get that entirely within the show, but when we don't see it, it's mocked upon. And this is where I think it's a really good time to perhaps transition into talking about what I think we both agree is going to be the focus of perhaps this particular episode with the 30-something gang. We don't see always individuals who are in their 30s who are just hitting a home run in life, who have everything figured out, who have a good job, who have their own space to live, who are married with kids, who are living that affluence lifestyle that I think society has come to expect from, most of us, if not all of us at this point in time. So the first thing I want to ask you about the 30-something club, because there's a lot to talk about with them. In the revival, they own up to their moniker. They call themselves out as the 30-something club. First off, do you think that is wise in terms of acknowledging the place that they're at in life, or do you think it's actually diminishing them more because of the negativity that Stars Hollow has placed on calling them that?
Ooh, that's a tough question. In a way, I understand the impetus to accept your position and to sort of wear it not quite as a badge of honor. That feels a little too rosy, I think, for what they're doing. But just the recognition and the openness about the fact that life is hard and that the world that we're facing as 30-somethings is very different than the one our parents faced. And, kind of banding together as a group of people who, still in their 30s have a long way to go, quote unquote, in attaining these things that society and capitalism and patriarchy have told us we need. I can understand wanting to own it. I think we're seeing a lot of the trend of that, of owning it and taking it back on TikTok through various trends on there. Not that I'm on TikTok. I just have to hear this from the YouTube essayists that I watch, because I'm like, if I get on the TikTok rabbit hole, I will never emerge. So not going to do that. But specifically, I was watching a Rowan Ellis video from about a month ago now, about the infantilization of millennial women. I highly recommend it. Go watch it. It was phenomenal. And I'll probably be referencing that video quite a bit and using some of the points that she makes in that video as fodder as it applies to Gilmore Girls for this episode, because it was just so eloquent and insightful. She kind of starts off her video talking about girl dinner on TikTok, and I'm like, why is this a thing, for one? Why do we insist on trends like this? But the sentiment behind it is basically women who call themselves girls posting about their unglamorous meals on TikTok. My dinner is ramen and Cheetos. # girl dinner. I'm like, I don't even post my really aesthetic food. What are we doing as a society that we're doing this? But it's sort of this act of reclamation and rebellion, saying I'm not a domestic goddess who has my shit together and who makes aesthetic meals all the time. I can eat like this and still be valid, and I can show off the fact that I am not perfect. There's a relatability aspect, I guess. I think it's a little inane, but that's just a me thing. But she kind of uses this as a springboard to talk about, one, why people who are over 18, female identifying people over the age of 18 who are willingly accepting the label of girl and kind of aging themselves down a little bit and rebelling against the notion that they should have it all together at this point, to the point where they're making, a 3-course meal for every evening. So there's a point to it that's a little deeper than just like, I'm showing off my ramen on TikTok. But it kind of segues into this whole conversation about like why the millennial generation is considered so stunted in the first place. And it's quite illuminating. And, it has to do a lot with the economy and the state of the world and kind of how the world we live in right now in terms of like rising housing costs, but stagnating wages and rising cost of living on the whole, underemployment, unemployment, outsourcing, all kinds of economic forces that are acting on our ability to participate in the workforce in the same way that even our parents did, and how that's impacting our ability to achieve these landmarks, shall we say, these milestones of adulthood, buying cars, buying homes, amassing personal wealth of any kind, being able to save, having children. It's not impossible, but there are a lot of privileges you have to have and legs up and good decisions that you have to make in today's world to get these things that were once considered like baseline. This is what you got to do to be a grown-up, right? And not everybody wants those things. That's another thing that she addresses. So I find it interesting, this discussion we're finally having about it. And in 2016, we weren't quite there yet. We were still at the condescending assholes who were writing articles in like the Washington Examiner about millennials killing the American dream and stuff. And I think Amy herself was one of those like cynical people who like to poke fun at it. And that's where we get the 30-something gang. And on that note, I want to read out a quote from an interview she did with Vogue in 2016, just after A Year in the Life dropped. I have thoughts, and I'm going to throw it to you first, though. So, but I'm going to read out the whole thing. Okay. For your edification, dear listeners. Okay, so the question that the interviewer posed is as follows. It was striking to see the differences between Lorelai at 32 and Rory at 32. Lorelai was raising a 16-year-old, running an inn, and owned a home. Rory is unemployed, living back at home, and still carrying on with her engaged ex-boyfriend. Why the choice to have Rory fall so far from grace? So that's the question. And in it is implicitly a judgment that at 32, Rory should have these things, regardless of the fact that she may not want them, but whatever, okay. Or that, there are any systemic barriers to her achieving any of these things. So just starting with that. But here's Amy's response. I think it's very real. I have a lot of 30-something-year-old people in my life now who still don't know what their lives are. 30-somethings are a little younger today than they used to be. Back in the dark ages when the dinosaurs roamed and I was 18, 30 was considered a grown-up. I had friends who went to college and put themselves through college and worked 2 jobs. They don't do that anymore. It's a lot of kids coming home and staying with their parents after college and saving their money for a condo. It's an interesting social dilemma that we've been witnessing. And these kids who have all the benefits, they've had a great education, supportive parents, but sometimes I believe a little too supportive. Sometimes you have to kick someone out the door and say, apply to Starbucks, sweetie. I don't care that you have a master's degree. Go work. That's what the world does. Emphasis entirely mine. But it's not necessarily a universal feeling anymore. And we thought it would be really interesting, especially since Rory was someone who had everything planned out and who had chosen a career in journalism at a time when journalism is under fire. Real journalism is slowly slipping away. To be somebody who is trying to make a mark in that kind of world when that world is in danger of disappearing, it's an interesting place to explore. We've done Rory as the good girl. Rory is the smart girl. Rory is the very focused kid. And we thought it would be more interesting if we saw what happened to Rory what happened if Rory's life didn't turn out the way Rory planned it? There was no plan B. She had plan A, and that was supposed to work. And as a lot of people find out when they step out of their parents' house, best laid plans mean shit. Go off.
Are we ready?
My body is ready.
Lorelai and Rory are not the same person. And we've had a conversation in the past about the overlaps in personality traits, in some commonalities that exist within their life. And that's there. I'm not denying its existence, but their upbringings were largely different. Again, let's start with the fact that Lorelai was a pregnant 16-year-old, something that Rory never had to encounter. Lorelai had to grow up hard and fast, especially when you chose to leave the sanctuary of Emily and Richard's house and do it on your own. It meant that you needed to find a place to live, a place to raise a child and provide for that child, which was not going to be cheap, even if it was decades past. First black and white difference. And then we have Rory growing up in a familial unit, even if that familial unit is only Lorelai at that point, that supports her passions, that doesn't push her into necessarily a life that she doesn't want to have for herself. Granted, Lorelai could have been a little bit forceful with like, I want you to go to school here as opposed to there. But there wasn't that same pressure that I think she got from Lorelai that Lorelai got from Emily and Richard. And then we fast forward to Lorelai and Rory experiencing what college life is like for Rory as she enters into the university experience and she starts floundering with it and she needs to take time off. Lorelai, I will falter for it, did not do her best with acknowledging that like my daughter is struggling, that she's needing to take a break. And that's where I think an emphasis in this quote that really stuck out to me is when Amy says, like, listen, best laid plans mean shit. Like, Rory went to school thinking, I'm going to get this done in 4 years. I'm going to accomplish what I want to. I'm going to pursue journalism and I will get a job in that field because that is exactly what I want to do. When her coursework was becoming too much for her, when she realized I might not graduate in 4 years, I'm going to be able to need to take time off. Maybe I need to reconsider what my career path is in life because Mitchum Huntsberger doesn't think I have it. Maybe I think I don't have it. Maybe I need to reevaluate what my life is going to look like in all of these regards. And this is overwhelming. And I need to back out of my educational experience right now at Yale because I need time to just mentally breathe and consider what my future is going to look like in that regard. That was something that Lorelai never had to encounter. And granted that she had struggles of her own with, again, needing to fast track herself into a career and being a sole provider for a child, you know, not having a partner or a spouse to do that with, but their experiences were very, very different. So how can we equate and say that, you know, Lorelai was successful and Rory failed because she didn't live up to what Lorelai achieved right out of the gate? Lorelai was resourceful. She was independent in a way that I think like Rory was never going to be or will be. And that's fine. Some people are going to need more support than others. Some people are going to be more independent than others. Some people are going to need to fall back on, you know, friends, family, whatever support systems they have to try and get them to where they need to be in life. Not everybody is going to be able to do what Lorelai did. So to, again, I think equate our Gilmore girls in this way when their experiences were so different, when they're growing up again in an economy that is facilitating different expectations and needs in terms of what is going to take financially just to even get by in life. And on top of the fact that journalism was kind of starting to actively die as Rory was wanting to pursue it, she had a lot that she was going to need to contend with that her own mother probably would have never needed to contend with. So I will breathe and allow you to pick up from there. I have more thoughts, but Your turn. Like, just why were we putting all of these expectations on Rory to meet the same level of success that Lorelai did when they were growing up even 15 to 20 years apart in an economy and in a world that was not going to be as graceful to Rory as it was to Lorelai, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, we could do an entire episode probably just on this quote and breaking this down. I think they did it. I mean, it's obviously meant to be a point of comparison because, it's too serendipitous to not be relevant, I guess. That each thing starts when each woman's 32. Like that's it makes it a seemingly easy point of comparison when it's really not. And I think people kind of crap on Rory because not because she didn't achieve what Lorelai had achieved, but because everybody thought she was going to achieve everything. And I think the one thing that Amy does get right in this quote is saying best laid plans mean shit because, I found that to be true in my own life, and Rory should know it to be true by now too, but she just is incapable of pivoting for some reason. But I want to go through this and the first stuff I want to say, okay, and pardon my French, and I don't normally cuss like this on the pod. I'm a real potty mouth in real life if you know me, but I try to keep it minimal. If you've got any youngins listening and you don't want them to hear this, earmuffs now, but fuck off with this. Oh my God, just condescending AF. 30-somethings are a little younger today than they used to be. Yeah, because we figured out that people's brains don't even stop developing mostly until they're 25. And therefore, the fact that we ask them to do more complicated future life planning before that point, significantly before that point, already puts them behind and at a disadvantage and making decisions they probably shouldn't be making. So, the fact that we're oh my God, you're 25 and you're still single, you're shriveled up, you're practically a spinster, just this whole focus on youth and having things figured out young is BS. I like the slow adulting concept. We, as you said earlier, we don't have to rush and we don't have to push our kids into rushing. It's just, we know more now about all of this and there's no point in forcing that. And it's back in the dark ages when I was 18, yeah, it was the fucking dark ages. It was the era of Reagan. Dude destroyed your economy. Just, there's plenty of information out there about that. I'm not going to go into a political rant right now, but just the way that the economy changed in the 70s and 80s and the benefits that had for established people and for up and comers that were just completely lost in the following decades has led to structural struggles for people our age and a little bit older and younger. And we've had to learn about this and adapt to it and come to realize that, when we were little and we were growing up being I'm going to be a lawyer, I'm going to be a doctor. A lot of that may not be reasonable for us anymore. The whole white picket fence lifestyle that we're force fed from a young age might not be in reach for many of us. And we have to contend with that fact and process that and find a way to live for ourselves and find joy in a world like that when we are constantly on the brink of losing it all financially. So yeah, it was the dark ages and it still kind of is. I had friends who went to college and put themselves through college and worked two jobs. Yeah, in the 80s, when college was 20% of the cost that it is now, when you only had to work. I think I found I can't remember all the numbers exactly on this, but I saw something in an article in the research for this that said, in the 80s, I think, mid 80s, you only had to work 306 hours at minimum wage in order to be able to pay off a 4-year degree. In the mid 2010s, that turned into you had to work over 4,400 hours at minimum wage. So that massive jump in how long it would take you to pay off your student loans is automatically going to put you behind. These things have grown so exponentially that we're not even in the same ballpark anymore when you're talking about that. So get out of here with that. It's a lot of kids coming home and staying with their parents after college and saving their money for a condo. Yeah, not everybody can even do that. But even if that's what they're doing, why is that necessarily a bad thing? If they want home ownership and they want to be independent, why is it such a bad thing that they want to be able to save as much money while they do that, especially when rents are inflating too? If they can live freely or cheaply in order for a larger financial payout later, why is that like so terrible? I don't understand the logic there. It's just judgmental. It's an interesting social dilemma we've been witnessing. Why is it a dilemma? Like, what? It's not even so much a dilemma. Like, we know why it's happening and what will fix it, and yet nobody will do it. And these kids have all the benefits. They've had a great education, supportive parents, sometimes too supportive. Yeah, I had a great education. I went to one of the best political science programs in the world. I went to like a top 40 school in the entire world, according to Times Higher Education. And I still ended up at home with my mom. Like, I graduated, I worked for a couple years, I worked my way up, and then I started having anxiety attacks at work. So I quit because I didn't want to have anxiety attacks at work. And I moved home to be closer to my family, and that left me starting from scratch. And yeah, I had to live at home for a while I did that. It left me unemployed and rootless and broke, much like Rory. And so 26-year-old Kate, who came to this revival when I was going through that period, I could actually relate to Rory, and I had some sympathy for her. I mean, bits of it have been eroded away as I've thought more deeply about it, but at the time I was like, man, I feel Rory on this one. But it's like, why should I be punished and demeaned for going and getting the education that I was always told that I should get, especially when the main character of this show goes to freaking Yale, one of the most expensive schools in the United States? You know, Rory's goals, people talk about her as if like, I want to be Rory. I'm going to go to an Ivy and I'm going to be a journalist. But the rest of us who go out and try to get college educations, who don't have trust funds to pay it off, or like grandparents to give us a private loan so that we don't have to be beholden to the government for our entire lives, are somehow lazy and entitled. I don't even know what to say to that. Apply to Starbucks, sweetie. I don't care if you have a master's degree. Go work. That's what the world does. Yeah, but we spend a lot of money on that master's degree, assuming that it would actually get us a job that pays us a living wage, which Starbucks does not, by the way. So even if we did go get a job at Starbucks, we'd still be living with mommy and daddy because we wouldn't be able to live on that in the current climate because we didn't buy our house in the fucking 90s. I have more on this too. Like, okay. And the other thing, I'm not going to go through sentence by sentence for this bottom part, but like, obviously Rory has this planned out. It's a time that journalism's under fire. She's trying to make a mark in that world when it's in danger of disappearing. We thought it would be an interesting thing to explore, but they didn't. All they did was be like, you know what, we're just going to have Rory try a bunch of stuff. And like, she's just going to be terrible at it. You know, the book deal's going to fall through. She's going to show up to Sandy Says completely unprepared. She's going to fall asleep doing her assignment. Like, they didn't even explore the world of journalism. It was just like Rory's very narrow version of journalism isn't working out for her. And they don't give her anything to do besides working for free at the Stars Hollow Gazette because she can live with mommy. So it's like, you're the one who put her in this position and you didn't even explore her other options. You didn't give her a social media presence. You're not like, hey, maybe we'll have her be a podcaster or a blogger or a travel blogger, any other number of journalistic routes she could have taken in the intervening 9 years would have been interesting to explore. And so you didn't actually explore this. All you wanted to do was take it and be like, you know what we're going to do? We're going to blow up her life by telling her she's pregnant. And so now she's going to be just like mommy. And we're going to make her be an adult, whether she wants to be one or not. Okay, now I'm done. For now.
Applause.
Thank you. I rarely get that worked up, but that felt good.
Get it out, girl. That's what we're here for. I'll follow that up with just saying, like, Amy, perché? Like, why?
Yeah.
Why do this to our character? And when I say character, why do this specifically to Rory when you can write her so much better and allow for so much more for her? instead of just defaulting back to like, I'm sorry, I'm gonna crap on it a little bit here. The where you lead, I will follow, like, apple doesn't fall far from the tree concept. It didn't have to be Rory's end game. Like, let her, she might flounder. That's fine. That's a normal part of reality. That's a normal part of life. Let me see her pick herself back up from it without defaulting to going back to ex-boyfriends, past partners, ex-lovers, getting pregnant by Logan, and then just saying, oh, I guess I'm gonna, like, default to the life that my mom had, even if I'm experiencing it a couple years down the line than what she had. I would have loved to have seen, like, she goes to Sandy, says she completely shits the bed, pardon my French, because she does. Like, she went into that just completely. I watched that scene again earlier today, and I was just like, how were you, like, you just weren't thinking, how were you not more prepared for that? Don't even get me started. And so I can understand why she immediately just doesn't get that job. But for all of the times that she fails, she can't reckon with that failure, and she just lets it continue to consume her. And I think that stems from just, again, the perception that she's like, in Emily and Richard's mind, I'm probably failing right now, and they're doing their best to help me with providing me a pool house and, like a recovery zone and a window of time to try and get myself back on my feet. But I think that also falls in line with what the part of the quote that says, like, are we being a little bit too supportive sometimes? Sometimes I think we are, because you kind of, yes, I agree that Rory needed time to herself to, like, really reevaluate what her Yale experience was and what the rest of her life was going to look like. But to have Emily and Richard just be like, come live in the pool house. We'll cut you endless checks for whatever you need necessarily. We'll just, factor you in and provide for you right and left. It's not allowing Rory to really pick herself back up, because she's just falling then into, like, a comfort zone and a level of, like, complacency, where it's like she's not going to move forward because you're just spoon feeding her provision. And it's not a bad thing to care about somebody in that way, but in this extent, I think it does go too far in that level of just, like, you're now being a little bit too supportive, when really maybe you should be kicking her out the door and being like, you can still live here, but you do need to go work at Starbucks or get a retail position or start figuring out something and doing something for yourself to try and get yourself back out into the world and back out on your feet. And maybe even some of those experiences will allow you then to reconsider what you want to do. Maybe Rory goes and gets a retail position and she's like, oh, actually, I think I'm really into, like, upper level management, or I could be good at hospitality. Or, I think back to the time when she revisits Chilton in the revival and Headmaster Charleston's like, have you ever considered teaching? Have those experiences and get yourself back out the door and into the universe that will allow you to think, like, okay, journalism didn't work out initially. Maybe as much as I wanted it to be for me, it's not going to be. It doesn't mean that I failed in the eyes of my grandparents and my mom, but maybe, society won't look at me and say, like, oh, I'm a 30-something who is just still trying to figure out what my life is going to look like. It doesn't mean I'm a failure. It just means I needed a little bit more time. And I wish that Amy didn't paint Rory into a corner with writing her in that way, where it's just so diminishing, not only to her, but in a way that she just largely dumps on the 30-something gang as well, with just being like, look at these losers who are just, like, just completely just rock bottom in life. No, they're not. Like, I'll turn it back over to you so we can just continue to rant back and forth. But I hate what she did to Rory in that regard. I hate what she did to the 30-something gang, because these are still just not kids, but, like, you know what I mean? Like, kids, so to say, who is like, we're all just trying to figure it out. Like, there shouldn't be a timeline or an expectation for when that needs to happen for any certain person. It just needs to unfold naturally and in a way that is good for any individual, whether that happens at the age of 20, 25, 30, 35. let the person get there in their own way and in their own time.
Yeah, we have so much more option now in a lot of ways, like more choices in terms of education versus no education, what kind of education, what for, what type of work we want to be doing. And it's no longer cut and dry. You're going to climb the ladder at one company forever. And so to sort of crap on people who don't want to fall into that like 9-to-5 lifestyle or somehow can't for whatever reason, it just feels kind of tone deaf for one. It like ignores a lot of the social context that all of this stuff is happening in. And I think it fits in with the overall mean-spiritedness of a year in the life. Like there's a lot of moments of different stripes, like the fat shaming and the crapping on therapy and just everything is an edgy joke, and it doesn't have to be. Like Amy in the past has been very open about the fact that she's bitter and cynical. She's aware of it. She's open about it. But instead of turning it against people who deserve it and against like the systems that create these problems in the first place, she uses it as a joke against like the millennials that make up like 50% of her fan base, like directs it at individuals as if it's an individual moral failing that somehow people just can't pull themselves up by their bootstraps, when it's really just not that simple. She directs it at the people who made her who she is in the first place. In some ways she takes aim at the vapid upper classes, but the commentary really just isn't that strong, especially when we end up really liking those people. There are very likable aspects to Emily and Richard and Logan. And it doesn't say a lot about the world or the society these people live in on any deeper level. And it's just this very narrow slice of this waspy family and their cohorts who we're meant to sympathize with, even when they're being awful. And it says nothing about the wider context. All it does is turn the 30-something gang into a meme and the butt of the joke. It makes them out to be pathetic losers, when in reality, they probably faced a lot of crap. And the fact that they've found support in each other and in their families and in Stars Hollow as a community, and that they're maintaining social connections and leaning on each other through moments of struggle and managing to somehow still find fun and joy in life. The whole Paul Thomas Anderson, I drank my milkshake thing. Like, that's just a bit of a silly cultural reference that is kind of, indicative of the fact that they're trying to keep their spirits up. And I think they really missed an opportunity to have Rory finally connecting with someone other than Lorelai, Paris, or Elaine, none of whom were particularly useful to her in the revival. Lorelai just like let the whole cheating thing slide, as did Lane. Paris was killing it in life on paper. She had all these accolades, but she was deeply unhappy and lonely. And that could have been explored more, but no, they just turned it into a joke about Doyle being a screenwriter, which, it can be a fun nod at the fact that Danny Strong was in his own right a very successful screenwriter and producer and director by the time the revival rolls around. But the way they did it is really demeaning to that kind of work, which is a whole skill set unto itself. And as someone who loves movies, why is she shitting on screenwriters constantly? I don't get it. Like, maybe the whole like Martin Scorsese bullshit of like the Marvelification of movies and like cinema's dying. Again, get out of here with that. She had all these opportunities to give Rory meaningful interaction with other people her age who were going through a similar thing. And she's just like, no, we're just going to turn it into a joke instead.
Yeah. I mean, and here's the thing too, like going along with that, Rory definitely looked at the 30-something gang, which again could have been her, compatriots in this regard, so to say. Like, I wish he would have interacted with them more and found some commonality and some common ground with them that I think would have allowed her, maybe even for her to achieve success faster. She probably could have given them some solid advice. You know, they were all seemingly there to help one another. And that's one of the things that always stood out to me about the 30-something gang, is that from what we saw with them, they were never wallowing in the fact that they were not where they wanted to be. They were still just very positive, like a very positive and upbeat group despite their circumstances, you know. And I think from the like limited amount of screen time that we got from them, that was a really big takeaway for me, where it's like they weren't not letting where they were at in life bring them down. They were acknowledging it, they were accepting it, and then they were using each other as like, you know, a system and a group of like friends and support to try and like lift each other back up, to support each other as they try and like put out their resumes again, find jobs, get back out into a career path and establishment in that regard, and having that, you know, support system in place for one another as they attempted to do that. So for Rory to then just look at them and just, you know, we see it at one of the town hall meetings where she's like, oh, I want to talk to everybody, but like maybe not you. Like, I don't want to acknowledge you. And then just to have even Lorelai just be like, I don't want to associate with them. And to have all of Stars Hollow just be like, the 30-something gang is weird. Like, you know,
They're sensitive. Like the AC is too loud, and they're like, they're little
like,
babies.
yeah, it's probably really bothering them right now. Like, look at them. And then just to cut to them and then just have them being like, it's like, why are we showcasing them in that way? It's so disparaging, and I hate it because it's not truthful. I mean, granted, there are individuals who are going to maybe struggle with not being where they want to be at in life, and that's fine. But just to completely railroad these people and paint a picture of them just being like, we should be looking on them and passing judgment and seeing them as lesser and just as failures, and for Amy to then go into the revival and give us the 30-something gang and portray them that way. Why is she allowing Rory to look at them in that way? Why is she allowing Lorelai to look at them in that way? Especially Lorelai, considering the struggle that she had, you know, as a teenager and as a person in her early 20s who had to really just, you know, nose to the grindstone to get by. Why was there so much judgment that was being passed from Rory, from Lorelai, and again, the entire town on this group of people who are just trying to do the best that they can in life to get to where they want to be? I don't understand it.
Yeah, it's that typical Gen X neoliberal bullshit that she probably came up through. And she's certainly not the only one who holds these beliefs of like the little millennial snowflakes who can't handle anything. Well, if we're snowflakes, it's because you made us that way. You're the ones who raised us. Okay? Okay. And also, says the woman who has no kids, who never took that leap for whatever reason. We don't know why. I don't know if she's ever spoken on it. But like, so you're creating the show about parenthood and about what pregnancy and motherhood mean to womanhood and adulthood, and yet like write what you know. So where are you getting all of this? Like, apparently your family life was pretty happy and you're not even a mom yourself, and yet this is your like end all be all for these characters, and there's just some sort of like disconnect that I'm not getting. I'm like, why are you using this as your framing device and your method of delivery and critique? And it's just, I know that she is smart enough and talented enough to use this show in a way to provide an incisive perspective on these generational divides and differences, and to understand and empathize with people who are going through different life circumstances like this, without making the show expressly political, and to take away that sort of like fantastical comfort element that people love it for. You know, it doesn't have to be a big political narrative in order for her to make intelligent commentary that actually speaks to the reality of the world without like losing the Stars Hollow charm. I know she's capable of it, but instead she chooses to just be like, no, I'm just gonna make these edgy jokes and y'all are just gonna have to deal with it. And like, ugh. And just going back to something I forgot to mention when I was reading her quote, she mentioned like friends putting themselves through college and had like using 2 jobs to do that. I'm like, so what you're telling me is that like you believe that none of these kids like this younger generation of Stars Hollow that came up with Rory, are able to get any jobs, have any side hustles to make any money, are volunteering, are like they're doing nothing productive with their time. They're just leeches, and their parents are here to like prop them up. Like that's not really, again, the reality of most millennials. Most of us are busting our butt and finding ways to monetize our hobbies just to get by. Salaries are not enough anymore. Not all of us have 4 Emmys to like lean back on to get us nepo jobs in Hollywood, you know? Like even your people are on strike, Amy. Like writers and actors are not making enough money to live and provide for themselves in Hollywood. And if those people aren't, what do you think the rest of us are going through? But you're up here on your little pedestal because you got your start at an auspicious time. You wrote 1 spec script and got a spot on Roseanne, and then like somehow parlayed that into an entire show on a network, and then you rode that through and you had all these other things kind of like handed to you because of the success of this one thing. And like, yeah, you've accomplished some cool shit in your career. Good job. You're talented. But like, that doesn't give you the right to shit on everyone else who's out here like actually working, and to not try to understand those people, but then to try to write about them and tell their story with absolutely zero empathy or understanding.
Mm-hmm. And I think you hit the nail on the head there. There was no compassion or empathy with how she was showcasing Rory or anyone else in their 30s who may be going through this. And it is still a very common thing now. Like the revival was 2016. It was only 7 years ago. You know, it doesn't seem like a long time ago, but for the time that even the main series was on, like, and even more so now as we get into 2023 and going forward, like as the economy just continues to not rebound or become what we need it to be as millennials, and you know, even for the oncoming generation that is going to supersede us, like I worry for them too. This is another generation that could be and probably will be largely screwed because we still haven't corrected this, because we're still not making amends to this system and to the economy to allow for our young people to be able to do any better and to succeed and accomplish what they want to without being so hindered by just financial BS. And, you know, we still even now, like a college education will just completely deplete you probably for the rest of your life in terms of how it's going to sink you into loans that you might not ever be able to repay. The housing market is still just in need of just a stupid amount of work. And so I worry, you know, even as someone now in my 30s, like if I were ever to have a kid, like what sort of society am I birthing my child into now, where it's like, are they even going to ever have a chance? Like, how can we do better for them to maybe try and allow for their success too? And I'll pose you that question. There's obviously a lot that needs to change, but where should we start, and where do you think the most correction needs to happen in terms of these generational differences and what we're teaching our young people and what we can do for them to try and make it better for them?
I mean, that's a really complex question to answer. And I have a political science degree. Like, I think a big part of it is going to be settling the housing question in terms of like really getting that under control and trying to bring down prices and make it more affordable for people to get into the property market if that's what they want to do, because there are upsides to renting. You know, not everything is about home ownership. That's always been the sort of general wisdom about life and money. But again, the market is always changing. And so what was true 20 or 30 or 40 years ago is no longer true. But in the post-war, there was this whole boom in property, and they were giving out sort of, you know, incentives to people as a way to stimulate the post-war economy. And we're no longer doing that. You know, the best we can do is a generous down payment and decent rates, like first-time home buyers credits and whatnot. Like it really only makes a tiny dent in the cost of living situation. Not to mention, like, a lot of places lack rent control, and just the rental stock is low in the first place. It's unbelievable how unaffordable housing is. And I think it's such a huge component that, obviously inflation is a problem, and the cost of living and cost of food and consumable goods is also on the rise. But I think rent and mortgage payments are such the bulk of our living expenses that would probably be the most efficient way for a bigger difference to be made. But again, like there's not a lot of incentive for people to do that because, and the interesting thing about that is that these boomers and Gen Xers were able to buy up all the fucking real estate. And then, so now the money is funneling from the millennials to the Gen X and the boomers. And so, like, they're actively profiting off of us, and we get nothing out of the deal except not being able to, like, upgrade our apartments. Like, you know what I mean? Like, we're getting the short end of the stick in so many ways. But I think housing is, most of us are paying half of our monthly income on housing. And so that's the biggest thing that would need some work. But yeah, and it makes me think of what Emily says to, she calls Rory homeless, living a vagabond existence, on the roading it like Jack Kerouac. And she says, like, why is everyone treating this like it's a normal rite of passage? Rory's a 32-year-old college-educated woman with no permanent address. That's not normal. And I'm like, actually, kind of is getting to be more normal. Like, over 30% of people between 18 and 34, I think, live at home. And that's just in the Western culture where we consider it a failure. That's not even including other cultures that consider that the norm. Like, we're looking at this through such a Western lens of this whole, like, again, the American dream that was sold to us of white picket fence, 2.5 kids, nuclear family, and the perpetuation of that ideal through marketing and indoctrination, basically, of like, this is what you should have, this is what you should want, and if you don't, you're aberrant somehow. And Emily is still very much of that mindset where it's just like, well, you're in your 30s, you should be married by now, and you should have a house, and you should have kids. Like, what are you doing? Why are you a vagabond? Completely ignoring the fact that, like, we've always seen that Rory doesn't really seem to want kids, and she turned down a marriage proposal because she wanted to focus on her career. And, like, actually, I was looking at this recently. The real estate in Connecticut, I sort of alluded to this in our interior design episode, but wasn't really able to expound because we spent way too long recording that one. But the real estate in the area that they live in, I would say the average home price for a house like Lorelai's would be about $300,000, which is surprisingly affordable, especially considering some areas of Connecticut are so expensive. But, like, it's just so weird that we assume that that is exactly what she should want when we know she likes to travel, and we have seen her aversion at the idea of having kids. And, her and her mom both sort of have this whole, like, independent woman streak. I don't need no man. So why do we think at 32 that she's somehow, like, screwing up in life? The only place I see her actively screwing up is in her career, where she's being too passive and she's waiting back for her big break to come to her instead of changing tack and trying something new when it's clear that her field is no longer going to sustain her. You know what I mean? And she's known for years that this is a dying industry. They talk about it in season 7 when she has a birthday dinner with Logan and Mitchum. And the fact that she is still incapable of going to plan B of any sort. Like, I've had a gajillion plans in my life. It's probably partly the ADHD. But, like, for example, fairly recently, I decided I wanted to go back to do my master's, to be a librarian, because I love books. I'm an antiquarian bookseller. I got that job partially because I wanted to go back to be a librarian. That was 2017. But as the years progressed, I was trying to save up some money and put some more stuff on my resume to make my application a little better, because my grades were fine, but kind of like only so when it comes to like competitive applications to a competitive institution. I wanted to go to U of T, which is like one of the best library schools in the world. Definitely in Canada, but also the world. And therefore the world. Sorry, little self-park in joke. But so I took some time to kind of get ready for that. And then right as I was about to like work on the finishing touches of that application in earnest was when the pandemic hit. And then I was like, well, the whole point of wanting to go back to school was actually wanting to go back to school. I don't want to do this online. I don't want to like miss out on that campus experience again, because that was a big draw for me, especially in this field where the Thomas Fisher Rare Books Library is at U of T, and like you can actually work with these materials. It's kind of key when you're talking about rare books and collections, to work with collections. So as time went on through the pandemic, I just started getting less and less excited about it, because life changed, the world changed, my priorities changed. I got into a relationship and got engaged, and now it's not that I don't think I would love that job or think it wouldn't be a good job for me, but the reality of my life now looks different than even a couple years ago. And so I'm moving on to plan B, or, you know, it's probably like plan Z in in reality when it comes to like everything from university till now in terms of the things I wanted to do with my life. Again, got a political science degree, wanted to work in municipal government. Actually, originally I wanted to work in international development. Then it became municipal government, ended up in mortgages. I've wanted to do a number of things over the years. I have a lot of interests. I like to go down a lot of rabbit holes. I think there are a lot of things I could theoretically apply my skills to. And I think Rory is the same. And that's why I relate to Rory so much. But the thing about her, I think, that pisses people off in the revival is that she's getting these opportunities and she's just not taking them. Her privilege should have sheltered her from some of the worst that the millennials have been experiencing over the last couple of years, because she had a trust fund and she wasn't swimming in debt that had to be paid back to the government. And so she let that get in her own way. She sat back on her heels and waited for things to come to her in a way that the 30-something gang probably isn't. It seems like they're out there hitting the pavement. And if they're not finding jobs, it's not because they're not qualified or not because they're not trying. It's because the economy is crap and the jobs don't exist. And they're like overqualified for stuff. And there's no way that they're going to be able to independently live on a salary from Starbucks because it's the only thing they can find. And so I think what really gets people's goat with Rory is that sort of like, you know, Amy says we're the ones who had all the benefits, but Rory really did have all the benefits. Not all of us have generational wealth to lean on, and she did. And so the fact that she's still struggling is a little frustrating to those of us who've had to bust our ass over the last couple of years to cobble together a living, when she's just like I'm living alone in Brooklyn, seemingly. How could she afford that? My God. I'm just going to leave my apartment in Brooklyn because it's going co-op and I don't want to buy. But, you know, I'll move to Queens. It's more affordable. It's cool. It's up and coming. I'm just going to like work for free at my town's newspaper. I'm going to take this unpaid gig, even though there are people who are like, go get more education and get a more stable job that's actually going to last. Charleston is still the friggin' headmaster. Look at how stable that job is. And she turns all of this down. This thing that we're clamoring for as our disenchanted generation, this stability, this financial security. And she just keeps letting it slip her by when she doesn't have to, like, she doesn't truly have to worry about it. And I think we're resentful of that. I think a lot of our feelings towards the class privilege of Rory and Logan and the Huntsbergers and the Gilmores and all that, like, really does stem from resentment that we don't have the same opportunities, and that the American dream that's sold, I'm Canadian, but like, you know, it trickled up, if you will, across the border. Just the idea that we can and should have all of these things, and that it should be based on, you know, your your capabilities, like according to what you achieve, right? Like that was sort of the initial meaning behind it. The guy who coined that term meant that it'd be like equal opportunity based on your ability. And it's really not the case. It's just become more divided and more entrenched and more like, if you start with privilege, you end with privilege. And if you start without privilege, it's really hard to get privilege, financially at least. And so Rory kind of took it for granted, I think, at times, in a way that Lorelai never did, kind of going back to that whole comparison between Rory and Lorelai question. And so I think that's what really ticks people off, is that she gets things handed to her, ideas and suggestions and offers that most of us would kill for. And she's like, no, I'm too good for that.
Yeah. Yeah, Rory definitely fell victim, and I don't feel bad about it because it was of her own making, but just to seeing herself on a pedestal that other people had like placed her on, but then like just allowing herself to exist on that pedestal and to look down on things that were beneath her and say like, that's beneath me, even though it's really not. And that's actually probably a good opportunity that you should take. You know, when she gets offered the fellowship and she's like, I don't know, you know, and she has so many opportunities that cross her path that she's like, I feel like she has this mindset sometimes of just thinking like, I'm better than that, but also, again, falling victim to that generational mindset of, this will not make me look as good to society or to my family and to my peers as it would allow me if I perhaps pursued something else. And that's really derogatory and just diminishing to any even potential employer who is just looking to take you on and offer you this position. You're not holier than thou, Rory. We've said it before. You know, come back down to earth sometimes and just realize that your privilege has afforded you a lot, but it's not always going to be able to give you everything that you need in life. And sometimes you need to stop and reconsider. It's not about how necessarily I look to high society or to, you know, the DAR folks or to like, you know, Richard's colleagues or associates or like, you know, that upper class society that my grandparents associate with so much. But if I'm successful and I'm making a living and I'm getting by and I'm happy doing it, get closer to like hitting that mark as opposed to what you think and what at this point I think Rory has been ingrained to believe she should have in life in order to make her successful from a looks appearance from anyone who is seeing her from the outside. And I think that's a flaw that she has and that a lot of people still have. And that's where I think we need to break the mold with that too, in terms of stop caring so much about how you're seen and how you're perceived, whether you're making, you know, six figures or not, and just know that if you're getting by and if you're doing well in life and if you're happy and you're providing for yourself and, you know, a partner or a spouse or any children that you have that you are also responsible for or need to consider, and you're doing that, you got it.
Yeah. Rory was always put on such a pedestal, and it gave her such a boost to self-esteem that people have called her narcissistic in the past, and I don't want to go so far because that really is a very specific label that we tend to over-apply in inappropriate circumstances. But she starts getting closer and closer to that kind of like narcissistic edge sometimes, because of the puffing up of her self-esteem. I think there was some research done, again, I can't remember exactly where I saw this, grain of salt, but apparently the millennial generation is technically more narcissistic than previous generations, because in the 70s and 80s, parents sort of became aware of the importance of self-esteem and of telling kids, like, you can do it, you can be whatever you want to be. But it backfired because it actually kind of works the other way around, where it's like, you don't instill self-esteem in that way. You don't just tell people that they're special, but you treat them as if they're capable and competent, and self-esteem will follow from that competence. And so Rory was always so kind of like doing it for herself, and she was pretty competent, that people kept puffing up her self-esteem, and it turned into this sort of like uglier phenomenon, this version of herself that couldn't see anything below her nose, basically. And yeah, it was like New York Times or bust. She got an offer for a paying job at an actual newspaper, which is exactly what she wanted in the end. She's like, you know what, I'm gonna wait and see if I get the Reston Fellowship, and then we all see how that turns out for her. But yeah, it's interesting because she's put on a pedestal her whole life, and then the 30-something gang does it to her too. Like, when she gets up at that meeting to talk, and she's like, almost everyone. Like, the minute she starts to talk, they are like literally sitting on the edge of her seats waiting, like, come on, everyone. And she's like, almost everyone. And they're like, oh, like, they idolize her too. I feel like if she did decide to officially join the 30-something gang, she would be their de facto leader because she's the smart one, you know? And who was I watching? I was watching like a financial diet video, and I think it was Ashley C. Ford on the financial diet. And she said, like, if you're a writer and poor, at least people still think you're smart. If you're anything else and poor, people assume you're a failure who doesn't have your shit together. And I'm like, that is so Rory to a T. Oh my God. And so she has this sense of self that's like based on like her intelligence and her perceived capabilities that doesn't match her attainment in life. And I think that's what people are reacting to, where they're like, well, if she can't do it, what are the rest of us supposed to do? And like, everyone gave her everything growing up, and yet she hasn't taken it and made anything of it. And so I think that's where the frustration predominantly comes from with her in the revival. Well, that and her crappy behavior and cheating on her boyfriend multiple times with multiple people. And just kind of being a jerk to people in general, you know. But
yeah, maybe not. She had a lot of growing up to do, and I think for even as we leave her in the revival, I think she still is potentially in line to perpetuate the same sort of just really negative connotations and behavioral traits that have been instilled on her from Emily and Richard, first and foremost, from Lorelai, but maybe not as extensively. But that is another question, and we've talked about like things I would want to see answered if we ever get a revival 2.0. Does Rory parent in a way that is allowing her and enabling her to still pass on these really horrific I can never say this word, generational differences? Like, is she going to do any better to teach her daughter a different way? Or is her daughter still going to fall victim to having all of these ideas of what success looks like, and then having an internal sense of like failure that could inhibit her emotionally and mentally if she doesn't live up to what mommy wants, what grandma wants, what, you know, Emily wants, if she's still around to see her get into like her teenage and her college years at that point? Can Rory do better? Or is this still just going to be, nope, we just see more of the same?
Okay, a couple things. One, I think we need to change the name of this podcast to Generationally Gilmore, just so that we can mess with you every single week.
Let's not say we did.
And two, that's a spicy meatball, because 2.1, another revival would be great. Part of me is now thinking that like it would be cool if they did a revival when Rory's daughter is 16 and like really nailed home that like, okay, how did we get here kind of vibes. Just like really pick up later. We have talked about this before in the sense of there's been so much focus on shoehorning the circle of life into the narrative, especially in the revival, which was really, it almost feels like it was written for 2008. You know what I mean? Like, or 2009. It feels like the references and the attitudes and stuff are still so much of that like late aughts instead of the mid 2010s. It feels behind in a lot of ways. It's like they repurposed a script that was written in 2008 for 23 or 24-year-old Rory instead of 32-year-old Rory. And so many of the characters are just stuck in time. They age but don't progress. And especially like the attitude toward millennials, that was kind of starting to come out around the fight, like the Great Recession. It didn't really hold as much by 2016. We were really starting to see the systemic stuff that was underlying this. And we had started to shift our tone from, oh, you're just entitled snowflakes who don't know how to do anything, to, oh, actually, like your drive is your passion, and your drive is like actually making a difference in the world and not just doing what the generations above you tell you have to be doing to be an adult. Which brings us to Rory and parenting. And like parenthood is one of those things that trumps money in the hierarchy of maturity. Like becoming a parent is really one of those things that forces you to become an adult. And that's why teen pregnancy is so alarming in a lot of ways, because these are kids who don't have the experience to parent and steward another human being through maturation themselves. Not that it can't be done. I've seen a lot of like very emotionally intelligent teen moms, and like it's not always a disaster, as we can tell from the show. But that's sort of the attitude around it. And it's a little concerning in terms of like, I'm 33 and I still don't know if I'm going to have kids. It's a whole other question that I would not have been prepared to answer at 16, right? I would not have been prepared. And so it's entirely possible that this sort of cycle of privilege and attitudes and expectations is continued with Rory's daughter. I hope it's not. I hope that Rory, sorry, I knocked something over, that Rory learns something from her own upbringing and is able to take the best of it and make it better, and leave the bits that were maybe less than ideal, in order to be a better parent than even she had, even though Lorelai's a pretty good mom. But I think it's interesting that they decided to make Rory pregnant at 32 and strip away everything else. You know, she doesn't have a lot of the other markers of adulthood. She's not married. She doesn't own property, and she's not financially stable. Those are sort of like the four pillars. It's like financial stability, independence, like living on your own, marriage, parenthood, agency. Like that kind of combination of things is your main thing. Creating a nuclear family of your own is like the perpetuation of adulthood for previous generations. And so that's what the expectation is. And I find it interesting that they decided that like giving Rory a baby is what's going to force her into that mold of maturity that she's supposed to have by 32, whether she likes it or not. You know, like that instead of allowing her to make her own choices and organically achieve success and maturation and financial stability through her own efforts, it's like, you're going to be a mom. And so therefore you need to get it together and be the adult in the room for her, in the same way that 16-year-old Lorelai was expected to do that with Rory, well before most people are expected to hit that level of maturity. And so it's just one of those, like, it almost feels lazy, if you will. Like, I get that it's meant to come back around and that this is the premise of this story, but I feel like a lot of people feel that it would have been nicer to see Rory succeed on her own terms instead of being like ham-fisted into this this narrative that didn't adapt and didn't reflect Rory's reality or desires at all. You know, in order for it to be a truly feminist narrative, she needs to have the choice to parent. She needs to make an active decision about when and how to be a parent. And that's removed. That sense of agency is now sort of like, oh, well, here it is. How are you going to deal with this curveball? Amy has talked about like how it's fun to throw curveballs at characters and like see how they react. And I think that's like, she's said it in reference to those final 4 words. And I'm like, you know, she has other options besides being a mom, right? And, you know, not everybody
does
wants
she? And that's sarcastic. She absolutely does, and that's just me digging on Amy a little bit. But go on.
Yeah. Well, in 2016, Roe v. Wade was still in place, so she probably did have a choice. Heyo. Yeah. So we have that. Yeah, and I don't know. It just something. I get it, but part of me just feels really uneasy with the ending being, well, surprise, you apparently forgot your birth control and have no control over your life. And we're just going to throw in this like massive change for you as a way for you to self-actualize. There's no other path. There's no other way to do this. It's only through motherhood, because that's the true path to womanhood. And yeah, it's interesting what they're doing with it in a way. I wish that the execution had been subtler and more nuanced in its portrayals and its explorations of these things. But it also makes me think, and I'm wondering if you agree with me on this, but it's interesting to consider Chris in this conversation as well, because he didn't have that same experience. Lorelai, when she found out she was pregnant, she decided to go it alone. And we will talk about Dad Chris as a whole other topic at some point, but this is just sort of like a teaser of it. Like, Lorelai was the one who made the choice to be a parent, despite the fact that she and Chris both participated in the act that made Rory. Lorelai was the one who took primary responsibility for it and cut Chris out. He was allowed to prolong his adolescence, much the same way other people of his class were allowed to do at the time. And so he had that chance to go through adolescence and his early adult years in the same way most of us millennials did. Like, he was able to go to school. He was able to take his time. He was able to try businesses and start his own stuff. And like, some of us have had to do what Chris did out of economic necessity, in terms of like, we weren't able to be full-blown adults to have these things and to be at that level because of other stuff. He was just sort of enabled by his upbringing and his privilege. But we shit on him for not having his shit together when most of us don't either. We're just pouring out on him, being like, he's pathetic, he's a piece of shit, he's a bad dad, even though most of us would choose not to parent at 16 or even at 26. Like, we're just so willing to judge him and call him terrible, when in reality, like, he didn't have any agency in that situation. And he was like enabled to prolong that period where he didn't have to be a mature adult because he had enough money that he didn't have to do that.
Yeah, I think a lot of the fandom, I mean, I'm speculating, but I think quite a few of us can maybe look at him and say, we don't like him in that regard, and we hate on him in that regard for choosing that path, and then for not having his life together because he was just falling back too much on his residuals and on the family name and on the fact that if and when I need it, you know, mommy and daddy are going to be there to save me with a check and, you know, expenses and what I need to get by. And I feel like perhaps we can even be a little bit resentful of that if that's not what we have in place for us. Like, if we have to, you know, get like scrape the bottom of the barrel and like, you know, pull out the elbow grease to like, you know, do what needs to be done in our lives to be financially stable because we don't have those same fallbacks. I feel like it's easy for us to judge Chris for it, for perhaps even being lazy and just relying on that too much. Which I think perhaps to an extent he did, but I feel like it's also just an unfair determination and a reflection on his character, because it's like, you know, to what extent should we really fault him for that upbringing and for having that in place just because it's not something that we have for ourselves? That's not necessarily Chris's fault, you know, that he was born into a wealthy family, you know, taking advantage of it to an abhorrent extent. If anyone does that, is problematic, but we can't and we shouldn't fault him or judge him for being born into that situation. And relying on it, because I think that sometimes it's just maybe too much of a just, I wish that I had that, so I hate you for it sort of thing. And that's where that can be really just dangerous thinking.
Yeah. And again, it comes back to the idea of the sort of like the bootstraps narrative, the American dream, your sort of American obsession with work and acquiring capital, acquiring property, that, you know, people who aren't working full-time are lazy, despite the fact that there are any number of reasons that can impede people's ability to work, right? This hustle culture mentality of like, you're only valuable if you're making money and you're doing it on your own and you're working your ass off, as if you shouldn't have a work-life balance, or you shouldn't be like allowing yourself to enjoy leisure, you know? Like, I see a lot of this come up where it's like, you're lazy, you're entitled, you want things for free, you want things to be handed to you. It's like, well, yeah, we live in a post-capitalist economy where we have enough wealth in the world and enough resources that like a well-run government could actually provide better for us than we could individually provide for ourselves. And like, yeah, I've seen sort of right-wing think pieces where it's just like the millennials just like want stuff for free. And then, you know, when the price of those things go up, instead of asking the government to stop hiking those prices, they want it for free. And I'm like, yeah, because other countries provide those things for free and those countries do really well economically, like childcare, education, healthcare. When you socialize those things, the outcomes are better for everyone. Not everything has to be privatized. You don't have to like pay individually for everything. That's like market capitalism doesn't work for everything. Let's put it that way. It's reached its limits in a lot of ways. And we're reacting to data and information and research that we have now that, you know, either didn't exist or was ignored in the whole like Reaganomics, laissez-faire market capitalism of the 80s. And so all we want is the ability to pursue meaningful lives on our own terms without needing to like work ourselves to the bone. And it doesn't mean we don't have a work ethic or that we don't want to contribute or achieve things, but it shouldn't be so much about like, well, you don't have all the consumerist trappings of success and therefore you're a moral failure. You're a terrible person. You're lazy, no work ethic, none of this. It's just a whole like attitude and judgment about our generation, which is not even a monolithic thing to begin with. Like there's not even a lot of solid understanding of or agreement upon the age ranges. I've seen it range anywhere from 80 to 2000, but there are a lot of sort of differences in there and micro generations and circumstances, not to mention cultural differences across the world. So like here in the West, it's like, oh, millennials are the ones who grew up with the internet. That completely ignores the fact that a lot of countries did not have that as their experience. And so millennials in Africa, Asia, parts of Europe probably have a very different experience, not only just for lack of internet, but cultural expectation entirely, you know, just assuming that we're the only ones who dictate this. I mean, granted, it's the most relevant for the show, and that's kind of why we're focusing on it, but it just everything about these sort of like think pieces ignores the wider context of immigration and cultural experience and marginalization and all kinds of stuff. Like, for example, queer people, what are their markers when their entire existence is delegitimized in the first place? Their families are considered illegitimate and they're often not allowed to marry. They may have fertility issues and no affordable options for starting a family of their own in the first place. And it's just like a whole separate set of questions. What about aromantic and asexual people? What are their life milestones? Why can't we treat their choices and their preferences and their lifestyles and their abilities and achievements on their own merits? Why do we have to try to fit them into this box of cis hetero white normativity and ignore everything else? It's so limited. And again, it puts the focus on millennials as the source of the problem. We can't delay gratification long enough to save for a down payment, so we just spend all our money on avocado toast. One, I don't even like avocado unless it's guacamole. That's the only form that is acceptable for avocado.
But no cilantro, right?
Yeah, and it's like, no, it's really just we're living under circumstances of such financial precarity that, like, yeah, sometimes we treat ourselves to something bougie because it's our moment of joy in the day when we can't have what we want otherwise, when our job is soul crushing and when we can't have the independence that we want. We're trying to just get by, as you've said before. Like, we're just trying to figure it out and make our way. And we're just being judged for our consumerist habits that were inculcated us into the first place. Copper boom reference. Didn't realize I could sneak that in here. You've inculcated into me a penchant for rampant consumerism or something along those lines. And so you're the one who created this in the first place. Oh, Gen Xer, oh, baby boomer, like the royal we, only like the royal Gen X, the royal boomers, have sort of created this consumerist capitalist hellscape that we now live in, where consumption is the only thing that we can turn to when other things are unavailable to us. Because, like, why save for a down payment? Like, why deny ourselves small pleasures when we think we'll never be able to achieve the big things?
That was all incredibly well said. And I will just kind of conclude my agreeance and my sentiment with that, with just saying there's a lot of blame that's placed on millennials for how the world is now and the way things are going, when it's really misplaced blame and misplaced judgment. And I'm not saying that perhaps millennials are scot-free. Like, I'm sure, to what extent we may see down the line, we've played our part in perpetuating perhaps some negative things that could affect the economy and the world down the line. But to place the blame solely on that millennial generation is abhorrently wrong, when it goes back to perhaps even the generations that preceded the baby boomers. And this has been something that has been ongoing and a problem for a long time and has just continued to get worse. But it's not something that started with this generation and this day and age. And I think we really need to be mindful of that and say, like, it's not us. It is not even solely the generation that preceded us. It may not even end with the generation that comes after us. But let's start trying to correct this now and do better, so that down the line, these issues are not as in our face or as problematic as they are now.
Yeah, it totally ignores the socioeconomic, cultural, historic, sociopolitical contexts from which all of this derives. And we're more scapegoat than cause. They're just like, oh, look at these snowflakes who can't cut it, can't hack it in the adult world. They're adulting, they turned it into a verb. Yeah, we kind of had to adapt to changes in the world that you caused and you didn't teach us how to deal with. So eat that. Anyway, okay, I could keep ranting about this forever. I got very spicy in this one. I don't normally get quite so worked up, but yeah, I've been reading up about this and rewatching the revival, and I watch a lot of YouTube videos, and like I said, the Rowan Ellis video was a very big inspiration for the meat of some of this stuff. So go check that out. But yeah,
it's fine, because look back at history, and where would we be if there were not some spicy individuals in life who just challenged the norms and challenged the way things were and pushed with their level of spiciness for things to change and for things to be better. So spiciness approved.
Yeah. In the words of Chelsea Suarez, Stay spicy.
I personally think that's a good spot for us to end on this. As always, there was so much that we didn't get to. That's just par for the course for us. I know down the line we will have another sort of, I'm going to attempt to say this word again, Jesus. The G word trauma episode, part 2, down the line at some point. So we'll get back to all of this.
It reminds me, like, you haven't watched a ton of How I Met Your Mother, have you?
A few, but
there's an episode where they all talk about their blind spots, and like one of them is like Lily doesn't know how to throw, and so she just like chucks things, and I can't. There's other ones as well, but I feel like your blind spot is your pronunciation of the word generational. Just something you're somehow like randomly that you never learned.
It's can't master for me. I don't know. I will work on it this week.
Say it in front of the mirror. Generational. You're used to the movement.
Yeah. I will work on that this week in preparation for next Friday. So that I'm ready for next Friday, but you should be ready for next Friday too, because what have we got coming up next week on the Gilmore Way?
Fashion. We're going to be talking about costumes and sort of some of the key moments that jump out at me as being like key to the narrative that revolve around clothing, accessories, beauty standards, that kind of stuff. Less so about like, oh, these are our like actual favorite outfits and whatnot, because again, there are 153 episodes plus a revival, and that would take up a whole thing unto itself. But I want to like go a little bit deeper and talk about sort of what these choices mean for these characters.
Yep. Stay tuned for that next week. In the meantime, if you need more content, go back and watch some of our old episodes. We've had some really good ones lately. Some special guests have come on with us in the past. So just go back to our history and check out some of those. And as always, just please always remember to do some of those YouTube things for us. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel, share this video with your friends. All of the support is just really appreciated by us, and it really does help us out. So we're always grateful for it.
Yeah. And on that note, we will see you next Friday for dinner.
Ciao.
Bye.